Echo, 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 echo. This has been my favorite series to make because you guys have really enjoyed it, and I've gotten by far more comments on it than any other, even the ones that get in the millions of views in terms of the full series. So I just want to say thank you for that. It's become like a cult classic on the channel, and that's awesome to see. So I thought instead of making 3, 4, 5 more episodes in this series, I would try and narrow this all the way down into 2 really long videos and see if you guys like that. And at this point, there's just too much information that I've uncovered to put it into a coherent narrative, so we're gonna have to do this differently in a way I've never done before. And that will be an iceberg chart. Now, don't walk away. This is brand new, custom made this one, and I'm really proud of it. But if you're not aware of what an iceberg is, really quick, it's just a tier list where the deeper you go on the proverbial iceberg, the stranger, more mysterious, and unbelievable the facts get. Now this one is completely filled with things that are true, are verifiably true, but even in these first few tiers, I guarantee you we're going to run into some things that you have never seen or heard of before, because I hadn't. And as we go deeper, it's going to be all brand new, so I promise you if you stick around, it's going to be really worth it. It's going to take us several hours to get through all of this, and I've tried to maintain some sort of order, but at a certain point, it's just going to be facts out in the ether that you're going to have to take as you wish. So buckle up, get comfortable. It's about to be a wild ride as we dive into this information.
Is KTVI Channel 2 St. Louis.
Coming up on the 2 News team at 5.
It's being called the worst terrorist attack ever on American soil as the federal building in Oklahoma City is reduced to rubble by a massive explosion.
A staggering number of casualties have already been reported, including many children who died at a daycare center. Officials fear the death toll will continue to skyrocket.
Stay with the 2 News team for updates as they become available.
And then see live team coverage of this tragedy beginning at 5 on the 2 News team.
It's 9:02 a.m. on April the 19th when a yellow Ryder truck pulls up outside of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. That is a fact we can all agree on. And it's this bomb which, according to the mainstream media narrative, is responsible for ripping apart about a third of the building and killing 168 people, including 19 children. And that's about all I can agree on with this narrative, that 168 people went to the judgment room that day. Other than that, just about everything else we've been told is a lie or a very much misconstrued narrative that has been crafted by the FBI and other major government organizations. And this is where we're going to reach the first item on our iceberg, that being the John Doe 2 phenomenon. As you may or may not know, Timothy McVeigh was tried as the lone bomber, leaving Terry Nichols to be tried as an accomplice, but as not being present for the bombing itself. This, however, was not the original claim. In fact, the Elliott's body shop from which the Ryder truck was rented that McVeigh allegedly used for the bombing had 3 separate employees in there who each identified a man that looked like McVeigh and a second man who was with McVeigh when he rented the truck. And this other man, for whom a sketch was produced, was unknown, so he's referred to as John Doe 2. John Doe 2 was not only identified by everybody working at Elliott's body shop, but also by dozens of other eyewitnesses in the time before, during, and after the bombing.
We learned that video collected from downtown businesses the morning of April 19th may someday be played before a jury. Officials won't say who or what exactly is on the tape. However, numerous sources have confirmed the tapes exist and that they reveal more than one bomber.
And as such, there was obviously a search for this man, because wouldn't you want to go after such a perpetrator? And in fact, it was not just any search, it was the largest manhunt in the history of the United States up until that point. And this thing went global. There were people across America and even foreign countries being dragged into police stations to be identified as possibly being this John Doe 2. And yet, despite months of searching, millions of dollars and millions of man hours, this John Doe 2 was never found. Or one could say at face value, he was never found. And that was not because he couldn't be found, it was more so because the federal government actually called the search off, stating, of all things, the most bizarre excuse being that John Doe 2, sorry guys, he was fake the whole time, he never actually existed. So all those eyewitnesses in the body shop and all the other eyewitnesses, the dozens of them, they were all wrong, they're just mistaken. But it does get stranger than that. The FBI went on to state that there was no John Doe 2 there with McVeigh. All 3 of the employees were simultaneously mistaking this John Doe 2 for a different man who came in the following day to the rental place. So yeah, essentially government's telling us a man time traveled and 3 people got confused about that. The man that the government said had been mistaken as John Doe 2 was a fellow named Todd Bunting, who was a private at the local military base. Which seems a little bit convenient that a government operative just happens to be willing to play as a scapegoat, but I digress. And sure, he might look somewhat similar to the sketch, but we literally know he wasn't there, and 3 eyewitnesses don't simultaneously have the same hallucination about who was there that day. That just doesn't happen. It also wouldn't explain any of the other dozens of eyewitnesses who saw this John Doe 2. which is something that the government has conveniently ignored and never really answered, like how that could happen. You know, a bunch of people see a second guy, but he doesn't actually exist. But knowing what we will soon, it does make sense why John Doe 2 was hidden from the public view, because had it been admitted who he was, the United States government probably would have fallen within a week, because as we shall see, there's much more to this man than meets the eye. This next one's fairly easy to explain, and it doesn't require much math ability. The bomb which allegedly decimated the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building has a very unique makeup. It's an ANFO bomb, which is ammonium nitrate fertilizer, as well as racing fuels. And as we shall touch on more later, something funny about the bomb is that over the years the size of it has changed dramatically, like a man addicted to fast food. So it is hard to say just how big that bomb was in April of 1995.
At the outset, let me correct what the senior officials have told us about their belief of the weight of the bomb. They think it was about 1,000 pounds to 1,200 pounds of quite possibly ammonium nitrate that exploded against the building in Oklahoma City today.
But now it's estimated to be somewhere around 5,000 pounds is a common guess I've seen, which means 5,000 pounds of fertilizer in 1995. And that's somewhere in the range of $5,000 to $10,000 at that time, based on the data I could find. And if we add in the cost of racing fuel, which is more expensive than typical gasoline, we're now talking something in the range of several thousand more dollars. So anywhere in the range of $8,000 to $14,000 is what McVeigh had spent building this bomb. And unsurprisingly, sources try and downplay that, but that's a different point for another time. And because of rampant inflation, that $8,000 to $14,000 number is essentially double today. So McVeigh spent anywhere from $16,000 to $28,000 in today's money building the bomb for the federal building. Okay, Cooper, what's your point? Hold on, bear with me. You might ask, what was the median American household income in 1995? The answer would be $34,076, sir. So you're telling me then that Timothy McVeigh spent anywhere from a quarter to a half of the average family's annual salary in 1995 on bomb materials. None of the other things needed for this plan. Starting to sound like a lot of money, right? Well, considering the fact that the only job that Timothy McVeigh had worked since leaving the Army was as a security guard, which he only got paid several $1,000s a year for, seems like something's not making sense. And this is the same Timothy McVeigh for whom, when he found $8,000 that had been misplaced at work, he returned it to his boss right away. Just a funny fact. But needless to say, the real point of this is that McVeigh had nowhere near enough money to buy the materials to build this bomb. And the same exact story applies to Terry Nichols, his alleged co-conspirator. Terry was ex-military, had no savings, and had racked up a mountain of credit card debt in order to stay afloat, which had failed. And so now we have two guys with zero money who then go and spend more money than they have ever seen building a bomb they could never afford. Got it. McVeigh also spent about a year traveling across America to different gun shows where he would stay in hotels and motels and eat out for all of his meals. Very expensive things to do. At this time, once again, McVeigh had no source of income, no savings, and was only trying to sell a book called The Turner Diaries, which is a typical spook novel slop story about a race war and how all white people hate other races. So clearly a bunch of bogus. Needless to say, the book didn't sell well, so he wasn't making much money there either. Not to mention that gun shows then, and still are today, hotbeds for feds, undercover, and overtly, which all checks out to me then. But what doesn't make much sense is that McVeigh had no bomb building experience, no knowledge, or know-how based on the prevailing narrative of who McVeigh was, so how then did he construct what is evidently one of the most powerful and effective fertilizer bombs in history in the back of a mover's truck in Geary Lake State Park in 1995? He couldn't exactly ask Siri for instructions or use WikiHow and YouTube. In addition to Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, there was a third man indicted by the government named Michael Fortier. He was another Army buddy of McVeigh's and had gone on record stating that McVeigh was innocent and that he could not believe that he had done this. In fact, he was slated to be a star witness in McVeigh's trial because he was just that adamant about McVeigh's innocence. Well, about 2 weeks after that, Michael Fortier was now somehow on the exact opposite team, saying that McVeigh was guilty and had become the prosecution's star witness, among several others. It's worth noting that Michael Fortier had advanced knowledge of the bomb plot and what McVeigh was supposedly up to, and he could have stopped it or alerted the authorities, and yet he didn't. And somehow he only got a 12-ish year sentence, of which he only served a handful of years on that. So then he would make the only person that I'm aware of who is involved in 168 counts of murder that only got a few years in prison. Gotta wonder then what's up with Fortier, and I think we'll learn some more about him as we continue. This is a security camera. You probably recognized it. For our sake, it's important to bring this up and to recognize that on April the 19th of 1995, cameras and security cameras were prolific. And indeed, there were well over 30 different cameras that saw the bomb truck on its ride to the Murrah Federal Building. Now, exactly how many cameras caught the bomb truck isn't 100% available. We do have very solid data, but the government doesn't want to tell us just how many, because that would make the rest of this entirely ridiculous. Because there were at least a dozen different camera angles of the bomb truck parking, and the more important factor, who and how many people actually got out of it. We are certain that these cameras do exist because the FBI has slipped up and revealed that they do exist multiple times. We also know that people have lost their lives over the very existence of these cameras. So it's not something to scoff at all, it's a huge deal. And whatever's on them is evidently worth killing for in the eyes of the government. But we also know they exist because within a few hours of the events that day, agents showed up to the Regency Towers apartments with ladders, ripped the cameras off the walls, and took everything, wiring and footage included, and then they just, well, we don't actually know what they did. However, we do know that that footage, which was a direct angle of the bomb truck, who got out of it, and everything that happened, along with the dozens of other camera angles, have literally never seen the light of day. Not a single bit of footage of the bomb truck, or what it was up to, or the people that were there, has ever been released. It has been 30 years. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not just suspicious, that's what we would call a cover-up. And I'm not shocked, because if we did have the footage, we would see that there were government operatives getting out of that bomb truck. And as I'll be crazy enough to wager later for you, and this is just how deep we're gonna go, McVeigh may not have even been one of those two guys there that day. That is one of the most clear signs of cover-up that you can get. There'd be no reason to withhold this footage unless there's something on there that is going to screw with this government. The same reason not releasing the Epstein list, because it would implicate corruption at an entire system-wide level. But I'm just a quasi-conspiracy theorist, so you can take the government at its word and just assume everything's fine. Speaking of convenient though, it is pretty humorous to me that McVeigh was arrested within an hour and a half of the bombing. I'm not kidding you. Not quite sure how that happens, but it really did. After committing the most deadly domestic terrorist attack in the history of the United States at that time, that took months of planning and required all that money which McVeigh didn't have to build a bomb that he didn't know how to make, this criminal mastermind, a man who went and cased out the building with such charm, as we'll see later that's not true, but with such charm, was able to persuade everyone to let him into the offices to see who was there and what was going on. A man who has been proffered by media as a literal criminal mastermind got pulled over by a state trooper 76 minutes after this bombing for not having a license plate. Are you kidding me? A man with such an elevated mind didn't think to put a license plate on the escape vehicle? You mean the thing, whether or not you agree with it, will get you pulled over like that if a cop sees it? Yeah. So this same mastermind couldn't bother to do the simplest thing to prevent himself from being arrested. After being pulled over, McVeigh was then arrested for having a concealed handgun, which still to this day confuses me and seems like a really weird government excuse. Also, the officer that arrested McVeigh described him as being easy to deal with and relatively, I mean, you're getting arrested so you're not happy, but he was pleasant enough, which doesn't make sense also compared to the later media narrative and later narrative that the prosecution went with for McVeigh, which was that he was a heated, angry man who had cop killer bullets loaded in his gun. It seems like he would have probably shot the cop if he had cop killer bullets in his gun and was looking for a fight. And it's just so fishy, but it is kind of funny to think that the FBI went through all this effort just to find out the local police had already arrested the guy and he was sitting in a cell just waiting for them all sitting pretty. Jesse Trentadue. Jesse Trentadue is a lawyer in Utah who is now a major legal player with his own firm. He's a really solid guy, a genuine American. He has a heart of gold. I can't speak highly enough of this guy. I haven't met him, but I want to. He also is a man to thank for so much of the information we will later be getting into, as his lawsuits against the United States government gave us countless documents as relates to the bombing, unintentionally I might add. He's an important man to introduce because as we go down this hill, he will also be a through line for so much of these crazy facts and why we have the proof about them, most especially what the government was actually up to and why they staged the Oklahoma City bombing. He also has a brother named Kenneth, who I want to introduce now, because we did a video on him. If you haven't seen that one, it's part 1. You can go and watch that for more info on him, but if not, don't worry, we'll cover him Kenneth in the next layer and it'll make total sense and it'll be faster. I want to say a quick thank you though for Jesse. You have done some incredible work, my friend, and I really admire it. Thanks for fighting the good fight. An important one to introduce is Elohim City. It is a compound on the Oklahoma-Kansas border filled with people who hate the government and really like guns. They also have an intriguing understanding of the gospel, and the pastor there was a man named Robert Mueller. And he's a character in and of himself who essentially invites paramilitary groups to train in his 400-acre compound. If that sounds like a lot, don't worry though, we will get into it, it will all come together. And finally, to round off the introduction, the 300,000-foot view of events on April the 19th of 1995. Before we get started into the meat, I thought it was sort of funny, the fact that we have McVeigh on tape at a McDonald's right before the bombing, and then we have Tyler Robinson on tape at Dairy Queen right after the shooting. It's just like patsies are crazy fast food addicts, apparently. Alright, so in the immediate aftermath, in the following days of the bombing, there were reports of multiple bombs being discovered by the news media. And I mean a lot of reports about this.
Down there, and the bomb squad folks will go in, and they will use that trailer. You see the bucket on the back there, sort of, this is how they would transport the explosive device away from this populated area to try to do something with it.
The Justice Department is reporting that a second explosive device has been found in the AP Mueller building in downtown Oklahoma City. Mike, you're still with us, aren't you?
Yes, I am, and I might tell you in addition to that, that in fact what we were told at the scene a few minutes ago was that in fact 2 different explosive devices were found in addition to the one that went off.
So a total of 3.
A total of 3.
Now confirmed through federal authorities that a second bomb has been found inside that federal building in Oklahoma City. It was an explosion at 9 o'clock this morning that did that damage you're looking at right there, blowing off the entire north face of that building. Again, you're looking at the north face there. A second bomb was found on the east side of that building. A bomb squad is on the scene. That second bomb has not exploded. We don't know quite the status yet, if they've managed to defuse it, but it has been confirmed that a second bomb was found on the east side.
What I have is that one device was deactivated. Apparently there's another device, and obviously whatever did the damage to the Mueller building was a tremendous, very sophisticated explosive device.
So President Clinton just called Governor Frank Keating, and he says that 3 FBI anti-terrorist teams are en route to Oklahoma City. Right now, they are saying that this is the work of a sophisticated group. This is a very sophisticated device, and it has to have been done by an explosives expert. Obviously, with this type of explosion.
And these reports were detailed, discussing how bomb squads had identified and deactivated 1, and then eventually, as the story evolved, 2 separate explosive devices that had been planted within the building by who knows who. With said reports even going so far as to state that the bombs that had been discovered were larger than the one that Timothy McVeigh had supposedly detonated. Now, some might suggest that this is just the media taking a story out of context or they didn't know, and I would say absolutely not, because this was reported for a few days and across almost every news channel that was on this. But the other thing is that these were government officials themselves leaking the information about the bombs and how many there were. Unsurprisingly, you are probably looking at your screen pretty confused right now, because the government just admitted the 30-year story they told is a complete lie. And you would be absolutely correct, they did. They told us the first time the truth, or at least a part of it, and then totally covered it up right afterwards. And it's worth noting that there was a much greater delay at this time, which came to our favor between when a story happened and when it was reported. It took the national news media a few days to get down there and to get set up and to really start broadcasting information. But the local media was on this thing immediately, and in large part it's them we have to thank for any amount of honest journalism that happened. That the story quickly changed to what the government was telling everybody, and by the time the McVeigh trial began, apparently everyone had forgotten all the other bombs and all the other people involved, because McVeigh was tried and found guilty. But this is a strong indication that we have been told a complete lie, and that there are 168 people and 600 plus injured, and everyone whose families were hurt by this, who have never gotten a single bit of justice. Let that sink in. Speaking of justice though, hear this out. We already mentioned how McVeigh was arrested less than an hour and a half, I can't help but laugh at that, after the bombing for some confusing reasons that really haven't been totally elucidated, and how that might seem, dare I say, convenient, and dare I say, staged, but something even more fishy than that is for sure afoot. And as I say, fish don't have feet, so I know something is up, and this story doesn't walk for a second without falling flat on its face. The yellow Ryder truck, for which contained the bomb McVeigh didn't know how to make, was completely destroyed in the blast. Or at least we would presume. I mean, that would be fair to anticipate that everything except for a couple of pieces wouldn't even be there, because if an ANFO bomb could blow up a concrete steel reinforced structure 40 plus feet away and blow a hole into it that ripped apart a third of the building, including hundreds of feet into the building, yeah, I would say I would expect there to be no truck left. And according to popular media, there is a 6.8 foot deep crater that it formed, this bomb, which was also 28 feet wide. Now Terrence Yeake's gonna doubt that, which we'll get to later. But for frame of reference, either way, that is enormous. I'm 6 feet 7 inches tall, and that is a deeper crater than I am tall. That's insane. That means this bomb punctured through pavement, concrete, and the ground. I mean, at that rate, I wonder what they would find, right? Well, it turns out they found quite a bit. The axle of the vehicle, which, alright, stronger part, flew 575 feet away from the bomb. Now, okay, Cooper's a powerful bomb. Of course it would fly away. Sure. Except for the axles on the bottom of the car, which is already heavy. And this axle is also the back axle, so it's sitting beneath over 5,000 pounds of bomb materials. And the crater that formed was 6.8 feet deep, so you would expect that that axle would have been buried into the ground. Well, no. Like I said, it flew 575 feet away. So someone's going to ask other questions, right? Which makes no sense, and I've seen people try and explain it, and it still makes even less sense because you can tell it's a cover-up at that point. But besides the fact that it flew so far, which makes no sense based on the data we have, but even stranger is that despite the heat, flight, and overall damage, the axle is still in one piece, and it reveals a completely intact serial number that the FBI was able to trace all the way back to Elliott's body shop, where they found out the man who rented it was operating under the name Robert D. Kling. It makes sense why McVeigh wouldn't have used his real name, right? But what's important is that these 3 eyewitnesses at the body shop were able to give such a solid sketch to the feds of not one but 2 men. Just recall that. There were 2 men that they reported. These sketches were so good that the police then began scouting the perimeter and showing them to people, and eventually ended up at a place called the Dreamland Motel. And when the employees were shown the sketches of John Doe 1, they immediately pointed out that it looks exactly like this guy named Timothy McVeigh who had rented a room at the motel. That's right, the criminal mastermind, who's now been arrested for not having plates and for a handgun crime that we don't really understand, has also then used his real name to rent the motel room for which he was basing his operations for this bombing out of. Yeah, so we're supposed to simultaneously believe that this is the most 5,000 IQ player ever in the history of crime, and also apparently a complete moron. I mean, he used his real name. Are you kidding me? That's criminal 101. That's criminal 1.0. And all in all, get this, it took the FBI 2 days, from when the bomb went off to when they found McVeigh. That's the fastest the FBI has ever done anything. They couldn't even print a piece of paper in that time, yet they found the greatest mastermind in criminal history. What? Okay, hold on to your britches. It's time to go deep. That was a warm-up. The man previously mentioned, Jesse Trentadue, and his brother Kenneth have a full video. It's the first one, and I would recommend checking that out after this. But if not, this will make sense, so don't worry, we're going to explain it fast. Kenneth was a star athlete and upstanding young man in high school who went to Vietnam, got hooked on heroin, came back to the States, and started robbing banks to feed his addiction. Kenneth, however, was different than most in such a place. When robbing banks, he would use unloaded or fake guns because he didn't want to risk taking someone's life. He stated that stealing is one thing, but feeding an addiction by taking a life is absolutely not worth it. So, even at his worst, he had this streak of goodness in him, which is important to note. Well, as a result of God's grace, his family support, and a heaping of self-control and hard work, Kenneth broke his addiction, got a stable job, married his longtime sweetheart, and started a family. And when his wife was pregnant with their first child, Kenneth would make a visit to his wife's family in Mexico. But on his return trip, he was arrested at the border for an unknown reason. Come to find out, Kenneth has an outstanding parole violation because he'd gotten into an argument with his parole officer, and essentially the argument boiled down to Kenneth wanted to have a beer after work, and the spook parole officer told him that wasn't alright. Kenneth decided to never go back, and that was it, really. He was just living his life from that point. And for several years, he was just being a good man, had no problems, like any of us might. Until that day coming back into the States when the feds at the border noticed he had an outstanding warrant for violating his parole. At which point Kenneth was sent to a California prison, which was logical considering he had lived in California since he was a youth, had committed all of his crimes in California, and had a parole officer, you guess it, in California. So all was good. Kenneth and the fam expected him to be in jail for a few months and then get out with time served and be done with the government's prison industrial complex for good. Well, it should have gone that way, and it was going that way for a time, until a few months into his prison stay when Kenneth was suddenly transferred to what is known as a federal transfer center. It's what it sounds like. It's where inmates go and are held at while awaiting trial or to be sent to another facility. And this was a big red flag for Kenneth's brother Jesse, who was a lawyer. But when on the phone with Kenneth told Jesse that, "You don't need to worry, man, it's just this jet age stuff," which is a funny sentence we'll get back to later. Essentially, it was just him poking at the frivolity of the government and how stupid this whole situation was, which we all can recognize. Jesse had some internal concerns, but was like, hey, what else could this actually be, reasonably speaking? And he was like, all right, I'll call you in a day or so, and I can't wait to hear from you. And that's where the two men ended their conversation, on that note of wanting to speak again soon. Important to note, because that conversation would never come. because Kenneth would shortly thereafter be heard by fellow inmates screaming at the guards to be allowed to call his wife, which is never a good sign. And this was sometime around 2:30 a.m. But things got worse for Kenneth and for everyone else shortly thereafter when an inmate named Alden Gillis-Baker, a man for whose soul I do genuinely mourn, because he would witness something truly demonic. Alden watched a group of feds in riot gear enter Kenneth's cell, at which point they fell out of view for him, but Alden could still hear what happened and it haunted him. Around 3 a.m. or so, he began hearing what we now know to be Kenneth, began talking very loudly, and then just start yelling, and then eventually he was screaming. After this, there was much kicking, baton swinging, cutting, thumping, and there was much Kenneth begging for help and for it to stop, until eventually there was complete silence. The guards then left the cell, at which point 2 men came in and Alden Gillis began hearing ripping and tearing of fabric. Then they left. But as they left, Alden made a fatal mistake, one for which haunted him for a very long time to come. Alden had accidentally made eye contact with one of the guards as he was leaving Kenneth's cell. And shortly thereafter, Alden Gillis-Baker began reporting some bizarre things happening to him. For instance, he was taken to the infirmary for injuries for which he didn't have, and was given psychotropic medications. At which point, Alden was completely helpless and was open to anyone's abuse. And in this case, he received diesel therapy, which sounds worse than it is, it's just being transferred to another prison. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where Alden leaves our story. For now. The following day, a prisoner was called in to clean up Kenneth's cell. Yes, that is illegal, and that is the destruction of evidence. And the same inmate would later attest to there being pools of blood inside of Kenneth's cell. Simultaneously to this,
you wouldn't have known anything had taken place when you left.
No, I did good work.
The state medical examiner couldn't get into the cell, but Stephen Coles did. Because of what he says are threats against him, Coles asked us to conceal his face.
In prison, it's basically the prisoners against, the guard. And once that door shuts, the only person you probably got on your side is God.
At the time, Coles was also an inmate at the Federal Transfer Center. He says he worked in the prison infirmary as an orderly and was told to clean up cell 709A.
When they opened the door, the first thing I saw was just a big spot of blood. I had to use a mop to get it up, and there was blood all over the walls, and it was bloody. It was bad.
He says it was especially bloody on the area around the panic button, the alarm used to summon guards in the event of an emergency.
There's a steel plate around it, and then right in the center there's a button. The fingerprint was on the plate, but not on the button.
Which suggested what to you?
My first thought was he was trying to get to the button. Didn't make it.
Pools of blood on the floor, bloody handprints on the wall. Not exactly what you might associate with a guy hanging, as the prison alleges. And what about those bed sheets that Trentadue supposedly used to hang himself?
What was the condition of the bed?
It had the sheets on it, both sheets, the blanket was on it, pillow was on it, and the covers were like turned back.
Had they been torn?
No.
Were some of them missing?
No, everything was intact. He had to have an extra one, and they don't give you extra anything when you go to the hole.
Kenneth and Jesse's mother gets a call from the assistant warden of the Oklahoma FTC saying that her son, Vance Paul Brockway, had taken his life. Okay, so you can see where this is probably going now, but let's continue. First though, pause. Cooper, who's Vance Paul Brockway? Funny enough, VPB, Vance Paul Brockway was an alias that Kenneth Trentadue had been robbing banks under, but obviously considering he was sober and had been robbing banks for well over a decade, the name hadn't been used since the 1980s, meaning that the government was incarcerating a man for which they had no idea who he actually was. Kenneth's mom then said, "Hey, I don't have a son by that name, but I do have one named Kenneth Trentadue at your facility. And I also have a son who's a high-powered attorney." At this point, I want you to taste the palpable awkwardness that must have been occurring on this phone call. The government was clearly not expecting that this guy that they had just was one, gonna have a mother who cared, and two, would have a brother who's a high-powered attorney. And you're the one who has to make the phone call knowing that men who are in the employment of the prison or the federal government as a whole just beat another man to death who was not only, which is wrong no matter what, but was also innocent. And then you guys had staged it as a and we're already cleaning up the evidence, which obviously is a violation of 1,000 different rules, regulations, and laws. But it continues. This assistant warden continues the conversation, doesn't apologize, or doesn't go, "Oh man, what a mistake." No, she says, "Well, we do free cremation." And then the mom was obviously tweaking out about this and was like, "No, we're not going to do that." And the warden kept offering. We know that she offered at least twice, this assistant warden, for the free cremation of the son, whose life had just been taken. This was too much for the mom, understandably, so Kenneth's brother Jesse got on the phone, and Kenneth had to haggle for something like a week to actually get the government to finally go, okay, fine, we'll give you your brother's body. Quick pause. I hope that the guards who actually executed Kenneth are watching this. Who knows if they are or not, but I want to say that if you are, I sincerely don't say this lightly. The following is so morbid, it makes you want to laugh because of just how ridiculous the whole situation is, but fair warning, this is pretty insane. So the body arrives eventually, it's obviously packed up. It's Jesse and Kenneth's mom there. The corpse had been staged like a 2010s unboxing video on YouTube, and inside the box there was a body, and it resembled Kenneth, but it had been beaten beyond imagination to the point of almost no longer being recognizable at all. And even crazier is that all the wounds that the feds had made, like the cuts, the slices, they sewed them up. And even crazier, they put makeup over the entire body to try and make it look less damaged. So not only did they have to unbox Kenneth's body, they then had to wipe the makeup off of all of him. And at that moment, a true hero was born, because Jesse, I think something broke in him. If there was any amount of trust in the government, it was gone. Because it started a 30-year ongoing legal battle that he is still fighting for his brother and for justice. And coincidentally, the Oklahoma City bombing, but that's a little bit later. And I don't blame him at all. This is a hill worth dying on. The United States government, the entity for which the majority of your money goes to these days, had actually just straight up an innocent man in prison. That is not supposed to happen. I should actually say it was 2 innocent men, because Alden Gillis Baker, the guy we referenced earlier, actually re-enters the story right around here. Because Alden Gillis Baker would give a very intriguing testimony during his deposition when he was getting prepared to go on trial. He would tell us the story of what had actually happened to Kenneth so that we had any idea of what happened, and without Alden's testimony, we would have practically no idea what occurred. So Alden was a critical witness. He was going to be on the stand in this trial, and he was going to tell people what the government had done to Kenneth. He was going to break this thing all the way open. So naturally, Alden is one of the most important people in a case like this. Well, Alden begins telling people that he fears for his life. This goes on for weeks, months, and eventually the trial is getting really close, just a few months away. Well, shortly before the trial, Alden was found hanged in his cell, very much similar to what had happened to Kenneth. And obviously a star witness is now gone, and it happened in the exact same way that Kenneth had passed. No autopsy was conducted for Alden, and his body was cremated. Needless to say that this is a really dark thing that happened. It does leave you speechless when you realize it's the same government in power today. That being said, though, this incident really ignited a lot of people and their motivation to find more out about this case, especially Jesse, who begins going on to these trials, begins suing the government, and begins slowly getting leaked out information about what happened. And over time, Jesse realized that Kenneth was executed because he looks very similar to a man involved in the Oklahoma City bombing. And that's where these two stories connect. Kenneth Trentadue looks exactly, almost to the T, like John Doe 2, the man we discussed earlier who existed, then didn't exist, then existed, then didn't exist according to the United States government. The one that had that multi-million-dollar, probably hundreds of millions of dollars, honestly, that manhunt conducted for him. That guy. It's not just facial structure-wise, even the tattoos and the car that Kenneth drove matched almost to the T this guy. Well, obviously it wasn't Kenneth, because Kenneth was 1,000 miles away with his family and had no history of doing such crimes. But it was just too similar, I suppose. Now, one must ask, why would you execute then the guy who you suspect to be John Doe 2? Wouldn't it be better to put him on trial and figure out what actually happened then that day? Well, no, because it's not just that Kenneth Trentadue looks like John Doe 2. It's that Kenneth Trentadue looks like the guy that the government knows is actually John Doe 2. That's right, the government was, in all likelihood, fully aware who John Doe 2 was, but they didn't exactly know where to find him. And so when a man with this bank robbing past, which matches John Doe 2, with the face structure of John Doe 2, with these tattoos and a car that matches John Doe 2, shows up, the government heads there, they execute the guy. So I guess then we must ask, who did the government think they had executed? And that would be a man named Richard Lee Guthrie Jr., a member of the ARA, otherwise known as the Aryan Republican Army. And they did this not because he bombed the building, but because he knew far too much about everything going on behind the bombing of said building. And therefore, the next up on the list that we're gonna have to explain is the ARA. Now, they appear in the second video, but that one had some audio issues, so we're gonna explain it here quicker. But if you are curious, you can go watch that video as well. I'm gonna try and explain this in the most YT-friendly way. The Aryan Republican Army, you might tell by their name, were described as a fringe group of men who admired a certain mustachioed fellow who was prevalent in the 1920s to the 1940s. And if that isn't enough of a hint It's the same man that JFK says the following about in his personal diaries. Quote, he will emerge from the hatred that surrounds him now as one of the most significant figures who ever lived. He had in him the stuff of legends. Echo, echo. That should clear it up. This group was suspicious, though, because they had some unique tendencies. They wanted to start a revolution to reclaim America, and they decided the best way to do it was to go rob banks. To me, it doesn't seem like the best way for a bunch of dudes to fund a revolution, but hey, you do you. What's particularly interesting, though, about this group is that they would rob banks at an expert level. No casualties, no extra time spent. In fact, they had a man who was dedicated solely to timekeeping, and they'd be in and out of an institution in 90 seconds or less. And they're confirmed to have done this at least 22 times. And the group, I kid you not, was known for wearing presidential masks and ATF, FBI, and other three-letter alphabet soup terrorist organizations jackets on at the same time. So basically you have a bunch of people wearing FBI merch and presidential masks robbing banks. Got it. Despite this, though, the FBI claims to have not known that they existed until 1996 after the bombing, conveniently, despite, being actively involved in the pursuit of this group of guys who were wearing their merch. So this group is intriguing for other reasons, though, besides these suspicious connections. And that would be that, can't make this up, almost every single member of the ARA was either an informant or direct government agent. And what's even more humorous is that Timothy McVeigh was known friends with all these guys and was also robbing banks alongside them. Now, there are a handful of people on Earth who can prove this, and fortunately all the information is out there, but one of the most prominent examples of this proof is Richard Lee Guthrie Jr. What's not really as well known is that Richard Lee Guthrie Jr. was in the process of writing a book, and he claimed to have knowledge about the events of Oklahoma City and the government's involvement and the truth about the whole thing. And considering he was a founding member of this ARA group, it shouldn't really shock anybody then that he would actually know this information. So he's a reliable source. Well, Jesse Trentadue gets wind of Richard Lee Guthrie Jr. wanting to tell all about what happened. And logically he goes, all right, I've seen what happens to witnesses, let's put this guy on the stand. Let's get a televised interview. Let's get everything we can out of him so the truth is out there. It'll give him safety and it'll help us in our cases. And I gotta imagine Jesse was beginning to realize the scale of the monster at play here, but I still don't think he was prepared for it and what's gonna happen next. Because literally the day before Richard Lee Guthrie Jr. is supposed to give a televised interview and testimony about what actually happened with the Oklahoma City bombing, the government's role, who McVeigh was, who the ARA was, he's found hanged in prison. I cannot make that up. Kenneth, Alden, this guy, Richard Lee Guthrie Jr., all three dead. All the exact same way. All in government facilities. What? Needless to say, the interview didn't happen. Star witness is now dead, 2 of them, 3 of them, and we are back to square one. We're back to Jesse having to just pursue documents and pursue leads and figure out what he can. And the chance to strike that decisive blow to the federal government and figure out the truth of his brother's death and the Oklahoma City bombing was now gone. But Jesse never lost hope, so he continues digging into everything happening. And he soon, through some pretty cool tricks that we talk about in the first episode of the series, Jesse will go on to uncover, via various federal documents, something called PatCon. Now, what is PatCon, you might ask? Well, it's a deep state government operation named Patriot Conspiracy that was aimed at, for the most part, white Christian Americans who hated the government and really liked guns, and the government wanted to destroy these people. The operation began in the very early 1990s and then really picked up during the Clinton administration. Most people, when they look back at Clinton, see a guy who definitely didn't have sexual relations with that woman in the White House, but deeper than that, he's a fellow who absolutely hated that specific segment of Americans, white, anti-government Christians. Funny enough, there were also a lot of Black and Asian Americans who hated the government at this time, and they also got a crap load of this issue, but for the most part, the ire is aimed at white Christian Americans who like guns, hate the government. But it's worth noting, government hating is popular, man. Alright, sorry. There's a host of lore that goes into this thing, but at its finest and simplest, we know that Clinton wanted to quell what is known as the Patriot Movement in America. The Patriot Movement was, and to some extent still exists today, but it was essentially a movement dedicated to bringing people together to discuss the problems that are now going on in this country, most specifically how the government is actively people just because they disagree with the government. Take Randy Weaver's family, take the Branch Davidians. Pretty clear case of what's going on here, and a lot of people were very angry about this, still are today, and rightfully so. One day, side note, we will get into the Ruby incident, but not today. That would take me down a whole nother rabbit hole. The Patriot Movement boils down to they're concerned with the fact that all of our rights are being eroded by a massive, bloated, corrupt, evil, destructive government, for which has been pretty easily proven thus far in this video. And so if you're Bill Clinton, who for a host of reasons hates this segment of Americans, and you're now in the highest office in the land, then what do you do to stop it? You can't go to war with them because there are more armed Americans than there are Americans at arms. Never forget. So instead, with only a portion of your men, you infiltrate these groups and this movement, and you collapse it from within, destroying all the trust that these people have with one another. You know, collapsing it within, just like they did at the Mueller building, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And so that's what Clinton did, essentially. Via the various agencies, he installed informants and agents in the various groups that made up the Patriot movement. And so quickly what went from a bunch of government-hating patriots is now a lot of patriots who hate the government, with a dose of people who are pretending to hate the government but actually work for it mixed in. And so now, if you're a patriot, you feel like you can't really trust anybody. And the records on this matter are verbose. I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere. And despite enough redactions to fill a book, we do know that beyond a doubt, a shadow of a doubt, that the United States government was engaged in such things as selling Stinger missiles, night vision goggles, automatic weapons, explosives to these groups that were taken, quote, stolen from military bases. It's a honeypot, essentially. The government was also helping to plan large-scale attacks, as well as having informants in the plans of large-scale attacks and not doing anything to stop them. For instance, the case of the Browns Ferry plot, which, while explaining the following, I'm going to be including documents from the FBI and themselves. Like I said, I'm not pulling this out of my butt. Essentially, in the year 1993 and prior, there was a, quote, confidential witness and source who was embedded into the CMA, or Civilian Material Assistance, which is one of your anti-government patriot groups. During this time, the group was planning to raid the nuclear power plant and steal the automatic weapons from the Army. The nuclear power plant was called Browns Ferry. And in the process, they were going to use a vast sum of plastic explosives, C4, which they possessed, in order to blow up something at the power plant and create a diversion. Right, let me reiterate. We have a bunch of guys with plastic explosives in an active nuclear power plant. Put those two things together, see what happens. And from these documents, we can get the fact that the government was fully aware of this plan, and even more humorously, was aiding and abetting the plan. Despite there being a confidential witness, source, agent, informant, whatever you want to call it, in this plot and in this group, the government did nothing to stop it. In fact, they helped fund it and make the operation possible. And if you read the documents, which I have linked below, it's clear that they're biased in favor of the government. It's only a portion of the story. But even with that, you can tell that they're admitting what they're doing, which is funding these operations with the intention of allowing them to be played out, possibly to the extent of even doing real world harm. Which is eerie though, because you have to think, we now have examples of the federal government allowing massive, large-scale, harmful plans to be carried out, or at least to get to the point where they might be carried out, while informants are in these groups. And then you think about the Oklahoma City bombing, which is the exact same situation, but at a different place. A group of guys who hate the government, and yet somehow get all these resources in order to carry out this attack. Things are starting to make sense with these two events in mind, especially when you consider the ARA, which is a group made up of federal agents that Timothy McVeigh was working with and was a member of. I think what I'm saying here is pretty obvious, so I'm not going to belabor the point. This is a little fact most people are completely unaware of. There was an old spy satellite that was mounted up right above Elohim City, so they knew who was going in and out of there. And I guarantee you that somewhere, if it hasn't been destroyed, there's some FBI office that has the footage of this and could show us exactly what went down there. Dr. Fred Jordan, a man you've likely never heard of. Well, he's important because he was the coroner for the victims of the bombing. And his job was to distinguish several things, damage, but also to decide whose parts belonged to whom in certain instances where that was a question. In addition to that, he also personally conducted the autopsy for Kenneth Trentadou's body. And in his exploration of the crime therein, he attempted to get into the cell that Kenneth had been staying at which point he was restricted from entering, which is illegal for the prison to do. But irrespective of that, they still did, and Jordan wouldn't be able to get into Kenneth's cell until considerably later. However, when he did, he brought a chemical called luminol. And luminol, when it touches human blood, or blood of any kind, will light up like a Christmas tree. And here's what Dr. Fred Jordan says happened when he used that himself.
Until about 5 months later, we went in there and luminoled, and it lit up like a candle because of the blood still present on the walls of the room after 4 or 5 months. But at that point, we have no scene. We have no crime scene. So there are questions about the death of Kenneth Trentadou that will never be answered.
So now, this is impossible. These results make no sense. Kenneth supposedly himself. Therefore, this should be a pretty much bloodless affair, which is exactly what Fred Jordan is saying at this point. Something is wrong, and he's fighting back alongside Jesse. Now, if you're the federal government, you can see that a man like Dr. Fred Jordan, who's outspoken and good at what he does and has the credentials, to have him saying that something is wrong is going to catch eyes. So you have to deal with the problem. You have to get rid of the stumbling block, as it were. And rather humorously, I'm going to add in this clip of Dr. Fred Jordan speaking on the incident at the time.
Federal Transfer Center, the public has the right to know, but Jordan says that's not happening. Do you believe he was murdered?
I think it's very likely he was murdered. I'm not able to prove it. I have temporarily classified the death as undetermined. You see a body covered with blood, removed from the room, as Mr. Trentadue was, soaked in blood, covered with bruises, and you try to gain access to the scene, and the government of the United States says, no, you can't. They continued to prohibit us from having access to the scene of his death, which is unheard of in 1997, until about 5 months later, we went in there and luminoled, and it lit up like a candle because of the blood still present on the walls of the room after 4 or 5 months. But at that point, we have no scene. We have no crime scene. So there are questions about the death of Kenneth Trentadue that will never be answered because of the actions of the United States government. Whether those actions were intentional or whether they were through incompetence, I don't know. And it's not easy to communicate with the federal government. It was botched. Or worse, it was planned.
Why is there a problem? Is there a problem?
Well, you tell me why there's a problem.
Is there a problem? Could it be because the family will not let this go?
Would you, if it were your relative?
There are some people who would question why you feel so strong about this case, because after all they go, it's just an inmate.
It's not just an inmate. Mr. Trentadue might be somebody I wouldn't let in my house. But let me tell you something. He's a human being, or was a human being. And I'm not saying I like these guys. I'm not saying I wouldn't be terrified if you put me out there with them. But I'm saying that they're our responsibility. And I'm saying that the investigation of their deaths is my responsibility as long as I'm chief medical examiner. Damn it, I'm going to do it, regardless of what I have to do. Now, the other thing is, do you think that the prison system, do you think that the court system is so accurate and so effective that there is no one in jail that's innocent? If you do, I have a piece of shore property just outside of El Reno. I want to sell you it.
Okay, so then what went wrong, Cooper? Because you're not yapping about Jordan for no reason. And also, everything else seems to go wrong in this case, so why would that change here? You are correct. Something does go wrong. Shortly after conducting this interview, Freddie Jordan would then go on to change the cause of death for Kenneth from undetermined to which, once again, you saw the recording too. He obviously doesn't think that was the case. So then why, you may ask, would he make this decision? Well, in reality, you and I don't know, and we likely would never have known, except that Jesse Trentadue will later tell us in a lecture he gave exactly what happened.
This was Jordan in July of '97. Shortly after that interview, he calls me up and he says, I'm going to change the manner of death to suicide. You've got 15 minutes to convince me not to. And I said to him, Dr. Jordan, the lawsuit has just started. I'm going to find the evidence. Don't do this. And he hung up the phone and changed it to suicide. I talked to his staff sometime later, and they said before doing that, he'd been visited by 2 FBI agents who'd removed him from the medical examiner's office, brought him back several hours later. He was white as a sheet, and he went and made the call to me. There went the criminal prosecution.
And so I think we've all come to realize with the Epstein case that blackmail is very real in these worlds. So this doesn't really surprise me, so much as I wonder what they had on this guy to make him go completely the other direction in a case as obvious as Kenneth Trentadue's. And to betray what had become a friend for Jesse Trentadue. I mean, he talks about how he considered Fred Jordan a friend at that point in time. It's just so sad because, once again, another guy who could have really damaged the federal government's case here. That said, we spoke earlier about how Fred was responsible for identifying which parts belonged to whom after the bombing. Well, when all was said and done, there were 168 people dead, and all of the limbs were accounted for, minus those legs which had been completely destroyed in the bombing, for which there were 7 individuals who fell into that category. But something else bizarre also emerged here. It was that there was an extra leg that matched none of the bodies for which there were missing legs, which means that instead of 168 victims, there should be a 169th. And so this should stand out to you because, in theory, in a case where we are seeking extra suspects and know that there is at least one other John Doe, that being John Doe 2, to find an extra leg would be beyond suspicious and an incredible lead. And this is a fact that should have blown the case wide open. However, the medical examiner's office, run by Freddie Jordan, who at this point had already been turned by the feds, was actually now also withholding evidence from the public. For 2.5 months, he did not notify the public or the grand jury, which was now convening and meeting and investigating this case, about this extra leg. Just completely hid it. And the only reason it ever came to light, and we're talking about it right now, is because a cop learned about this leg and then leaked it to the press. Shout out to that cop. Which caused an awkward hiccup for Freddie and the feds, which should be a band name for certain. Because when Fred was asked about the leg and why he withheld its existence from the world, he had a very strange response, saying that they didn't need to know. Solid move, my friend. What a great orator. What a great wordsmith. However, the saga of the left leg does continue from there. The initial reporting of the leg described it as wearing what you describe as combat boots and paramilitary fatigues. A report for which identically matches John Doe 2, down to the believed height of the body, as well as what John Doe 2 was wearing, and also just matches the Timothy McVeigh group style. And the leg was also described, importantly, as having light or lighter skin. And let's add, light-skinned at this time is not just saying black with lighter skin, it's saying a person with light skin. It's important to define terms these days, people. Just want to get that out of the way. But I digress. Knowing that Freddie is corrupt, though, this obviously can't stand. The clear evidence that there was someone else there, something's got to change, right? And so, this next part can't be made up, though. What was originally the leg of a presumably white or whitish male in military clothing, like McVeigh and crew were, with an overall description that matches the squad that McVeigh was allegedly rolling with, down to the height, like we said, that was reported by all these eyewitnesses. Sorry, I'm laughing. Was later changed by Freddie Jordan into the report of being a black woman with shaved legs. He couldn't go with a better excuse or cover story than that. A now basically white guy's leg, like me, except for shorter, was now a black woman. So now, not only do we have disappearing witnesses, we also have transracial legs. This is one of the most insane cases ever. Suffice it to say, to this day, we don't know who that leg belonged to. The government probably does, but we don't. And it has been lied about ever since. Whew! This 60 Minutes interview is one of the only known interviews video recorded with Timmy McVeigh. And the weirdness is apparent. I'll let it speak for itself, but I want you to really listen to what's being said.
I went over there hyped up, just like everyone else. Not only is Saddam evil, all Iraqis are evil. What I experienced, though, was an entirely different ballgame. And being face-to-face, close with these people, in personal contact, you realize they're just people like you.
It's hard for some people to come to grips with you as the same person who was commended by the Army, who received the Bronze Star, who received the Combat Medal, as being the same person who was convicted in the Oklahoma City bombing. They can't put the two together. You understand that?
I do understand. They perceive, and many people have thrown this at me, they say, well, Tim, if we think you're guilty, imagine the paradox. In the Gulf War, you were given medals for killing people. So I've faced that that issue quite a few times with people that bring it up to me.
And how do you explain it then?
At that point, usually I just leave it at that and say that it is an interesting paradox.
We met him at the maximum security U.S. penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he now sits on death row awaiting a date for his execution. Because of his appeal, one of the conditions his lawyer laid down was that we not ask him directly, are you the Oklahoma City bomber?
Maybe one of the benefits of me talking to you today is that you'll see that maybe not everything is true that you've heard about me.
For example, what's not true?
Well, am I pure evil? Am I the face of terror sitting here in front of you?
It's worth noting that I only edited out the pauses where there were segments that weren't McVeigh in this interview. Everything else is in his own words and I haven't adjusted. The interview continues beyond this, but overall it's pretty noticeably short considering how important of an interview this would be. The bulk of the content in that segment is filler, and many people seem to think that said interview was also cut down from what they originally saw on 60 Minutes on television when it was broadcast. because as one can see, the way Tim is presented doesn't match at all what he's originally described as being some mastermind. And I find, once again, it's just this case is a series of ridiculous events. The interviewer was told by the legal team for Tim that the one question he cannot ask Timothy is if he's the bomber. Why? This guy's already on death row for the bombing. A jury has convicted him of such, wrongfully, but of such. So then why couldn't you ask Timothy if he's the bomber? How does it make sense to anybody? All right, breather over. Let's talk about Carol Howe. We're here for it, you guys. Okay, I'm gonna make her timeline as short as possible because she is also discussed for a while in the other video. If you want to go see it, there's more info in there. But here we go. Carol Howe was originally a kind young lady who originated from a wealthy family. Importantly, she shared your typical views on race in America until she was attacked by a black gang and everything changed for her. She decided to call the Dial a Racist hotline, that's the actual name, and the phone was answered by a man on the other end named Dennis Mahone, who was living in Elohim City, that place we talked about earlier. Eventually, a relationship sparks up. Carol goes on to Elohim, where she begins living. At some point after moving in there, Carol bursts into a police station and reports that Dennis Mahone had raped her. At which point, Carol's mind shifts again, and she doesn't quite know what to do or where to go, which is when the FBI then gets involved. Not to help her, obviously, it's the FBI, but instead to ask Carol if she now wants to become an informant. Okay, let's just take advantage of a woman at a weak and vulnerable stage. They offer her something like $500 a week and paid expenses to go back to Elohim City and to Dennis and to be an informant for them. Okay, Carol, shockingly, probably because she's pretty messed up in the head by what's happened to her, goes back and actually does become an informant and becomes one of the ATF's most prolific informants, in fact, and becomes a close confidant and friend of all of them. And as such, she becomes privy and begins hearing things. Initially, it's conversations about bombs, and then it's conversations about wanting to bomb buildings, and then it's conversations about wanting to bomb federal buildings, and then it's conversations about wanting to bomb a specific federal building, which soon becomes a plan to bomb a federal building in Oklahoma City, which then becomes a plan to do it in April of 1995. Carol obviously notified her handler of all of these things, but nothing actually happened despite them telling her that it would. And as we know, the federal building in Oklahoma did actually blow up in 1995. Carol called her informer after this happened and was furious, understandably, and said that she'd been risking her life to get you guys this information, you hadn't listened, and now look what's happened. And the handler was basically like, yeah, we know. But things are stranger even than that. When Timothy McVeigh's face is then publicized, Carol immediately recognizes him and calls her handler back, and tells her handler that she recognizes McVeigh and has seen him before with members of the ARA and at Elohim City, engaged in paramilitary activities, and knows that he's a part of a group. Okay. And after this, Carol Howe is immediately placed onto the not trustworthy informant list for the ATF, and stays that way for a very long time. And then eventually, Jesse Trentadue, the absolute bulldog that he is, finds out Carol Howe exists and goes, man, she knows it. Let's get her on the stand. And because we live in a joke country, the government starts subpoenaing and countersuing Carol Howe, so she's too afraid to go and testify on behalf of McVeigh and blow this whole narrative out of the water. So Carol gets lawfared, is not able to testify, and isn't able to give the reports that would have otherwise blown open the case. So the government, once again, prevents a witness from coming to the stand. Also worth noting, apparently she's fortunate because she didn't have herself hanged, but I don't know where she is today or if she's still alive. So maybe it actually happened to her eventually because she knows way too much information. Fortunately though, no matter what, and I hope she's all right, sincerely, she did manage to get a ton of information to Jesse so that we actually have a lot more than we otherwise would. In late 03, early 2004, 03 represent, year I was born, you have Terry Nichols sitting in prison serving out a life sentence for the federal trial, and he's also now on trial for a state case against him for the bombing. When a lawyer named Michael Selby enters the prison and starts talking to Terry Nichols, making him offers that literally should be impossible because he's a federal government employee. Essentially what Selby offers is that he can have Terry's sentence commuted from death down to life in prison. I don't know how that's much better, but besides the point. And Selby offers, bizarrely, being able to do this by saying, hey, we're just gonna have witnesses not come to the stand and agents aren't gonna testify against you because we're gonna tell them not to. Such an offer shouldn't exist. First of all, like we said, he's a Fed, not a state agent. But second of all, you're admitting to being able to get witnesses to not testify or to testify in the way you want them to, so you can manipulate the case to have it appear the way you would like. How interesting is that? I wonder where we've seen that before. Also worth noting that Michael Selby was working for Attorney General Ashcroft at the time, so a very powerful man in the Department of Justice in America as a whole. Okay, back to the sentence. Selby goes, all right, bro, we're gonna commute this thing for you. You just gotta do me a few favors. The most important favor of which, though, was that Nichols had to tell Selby where those other explosives were, man. What'd you do with them? Now, these explosives were the extra explosives left over for the bomb-making materials for the Anfo bomb, which supposedly did the damage to the Mueller building and killed all those people. And at face value, this shouldn't be that big of a deal because Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh supposedly got them from a robbery of a man named Roger Moore. Now, Roger Moore is a whole character in and of himself and is a bridge between part 2 and part 3 of this dive. But what's important to know about Roger is that the mainstream narrative is he's this innocent gun dealer who got robbed and his stuff was sold to help fund the bombing. Although that story evolved with time and there was really no evidence backing it up, which is pretty crazy. This guy named Roger was living his dream on his farm in Arkansas. He had about 90 separate firearms in his house. He had precious gems, precious metals, all sorts of stuff. Now, how Terry knew this, I don't think they ever explained in the trial, but Terry and McVeigh, they go and rob this guy. You have Roger Moore walking around outside his property. When he's walking back to his house, hears a vehicle pull up to his house and pull into the carport. A guy gets out in a ski mask, points a shotgun at Roger, and then says, get on your knees. They take Roger inside, make him crawl, in fact, and then they duct tape him up, steal it all, and go. Now, Roger tells his story. It changes every single time he says it, and it's also really short. I'm not certain if he ever explains why these guys were able to get to all of his guns. Not any of them were behind any code, or his precious gems were just sitting out. His gold was just sitting out, apparently. So you then have the question of how did they get into all that? How did they know that this stuff was there? But my favorite question is, why does a guy who hates the government, wants to kill federal agents, in theory, and has 90 separate guns, doesn't walk around with a gun, not even on his property? And his excuse was there was no one to shoot out there, which apparently there was that day. But also, you don't just use guns on people, you use them on animals. And in rural Arkansas, there are all sorts of things you might need to shoot. So that excuse doesn't really hold up. Essentially though, the guys, like I said, they get 60 grand out of this deal, they sell it all, and they go. What's also not very popularly reported though, is that they stole something called kinestic from Roger as well. And kinestic is a powerful explosive, which was reportedly used in the bombing. Circling back here. Now, when this offer is made to Terry, he goes, great. They're finally going after Roger Moore because Terry and McVeigh had said, Roger Moore wasn't robbed. He actually gave us this stuff to fund the bombing and gave us the explosives for the bomb. And Terry, being a man who, as we shall see, was likely nowhere near as involved as is suspected, was furious that Roger Moore, who had given them these explosives, had gotten off and no one was pursuing him. And so Terry goes, hey dude, awesome, you're finally going after Roger? All right, let's do this. This is where the explosives are gonna be. And as he's saying this Michael Selby guy starts screaming at him, saying, no, we're not going after Roger. Roger's untouchable. And in that moment, Selby overplays his hand because a guy who works for an attorney general and who's coming in here making this secret deep state offer is now saying that someone is above pursuit and is untouchable by the federal government. Okay, so now we know that in all likelihood, Terry and McVeigh weren't lying. This Roger guy had supplied them these explosives, and even more so, he's so untouchable, that means he's probably a spook. Funny enough though, Terry did reveal in this process where the explosives were, and I can't make this up. This just, once again, it's another one of those things in this story that makes no sense. The explosives had been in Terry's house the entire time. They were hidden in his house, and for 10 years they had sat there while the federal government had searched it over and over, and they never found the explosives. So they had to go to the guy to try and help with their cover-up, the guy that they had put in prison, who was also part of the you get it. And so Terry tells them this, and they find the explosives. But it took them 10 years, right, and thousands of man-hours, searching, and however many hundreds of thousands or more dollars. They were in the guy's house, and the federal government tries to tell us they found Timothy McVeigh in 2 days. They couldn't find the explosives, the rest of them, for a decade. Yeah, bite me. I just can't even lie. We deserve better psyops at this point. This is so obvious it hurts. Later though, this secret meeting came out in an affidavit that Jesse had published for Nichols. And right after it comes out, Michael Selby calls Jesse Trentadue and starts screaming at him saying, you got me effing killed. And from what I can tell, he didn't actually, but the guy then reports his office was ransacked and everything was thrown everywhere. So clearly someone was very displeased about his offer failing. So knowing that Timothy McVeigh had no idea how to make this bomb and couldn't have afforded to. We have to now ask other questions. Since the bomb was made, someone else had to have helped him, or someone's. And there we're going to teleport to Geary Lake State Park, where the bomb was allegedly manufactured by Timothy McVeigh the night before the bombing in the back of a Ryder truck. Okay, weird place to do that, by the way. I should say it's reported that Terry Nichols helps, but he also has no idea how to build a bomb, in theory. But either way, that story has to be completely false because there are eyewitnesses who report seeing the Ryder truck in the same spot where the bomb was being manufactured days in advance of when Timothy McVeigh was even supposed to be in Oklahoma. I'm talking as early as April 11th. And like I said, the FBI says he didn't get there till the 15th or so. And these eyewitnesses also then report a second Ryder truck with a barely visible Ryder logo also being parked there. And so now it's obvious that two people must be involved. I mean, and Nichols had to have been more directly involved than has been reported. But we also have to ask the question of why is there a second Ryder truck then, and what happened to it? Good and valid questions, sure, but a more important one is generated by the testimony of a man named Robert Nelson. He states that he drove into Geary Lake on April 17th or 18th, and at that time he saw clear as day the Ryder truck, but it wasn't alone. Instead, it was surrounded by not only other vehicles, but at least 4 or 5 men. Unsurprisingly, Robert was able to testify at McVeigh's trial, but no one ever really considered it, and no one ever thought about, oh, that would mean other people were involved. And still today, the lone bomber theory is the prominent one, despite someone like this. Let's continue though, because the references to 4 or 5 people is really something, and we actually have an idea, a very solid one, of who those men were, at least some of them. And these multiple men make even more sense when you realize that the FBI produced at minimum 3 sketches in the aftermath of the bombing, and I've seen reports as high as 4, so take that with a grain of salt. Those sketches though, obviously later wiped from the record, so who knows what happened to those. Also interesting, in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, 2 Muslim men were reported as running away from the scene wearing matching blue, if I recall correctly, jumpsuits.
The latest news that we do have regarding suspects is the FBI is looking for 3 men described as Middle Eastern, about 20 to 25 years old, driving a brown Chevy pickup truck. And CNN has learned that information and activities coming out of the Middle East over the past few weeks have generated concerns among several federal agencies about possible terrorist activity in the U.S. And we'll continue our coverage in just a moment.
And these 2 men also, shortly after the incident, disappeared from reports. Funny how that works. This one always gets me as one of the weirdest on this list, but it has to go up here because of what happens later. Eyewitnesses to the aftermath of the bombing report being held back from helping survivors because unknown men coming from unmarked vehicles wearing unmarked jackets had arrived at the scene. They pulled up right to the building, and what we learned later from first responders is that they didn't want to, but they were told in order to hold the people back. And why they were told to hold back was because there were important documents in the building that must be acquired before anyone can get any help, and that they were not going to leave a single piece of paper behind, and that they were not going to let anyone inside the building get the help they needed until they had these documents. Now, I have a theory about who those documents belonged to and what they were about, but that is for later. This said, I noticed a trend, and feel free to look it up for yourself, but many of the people involved in the cover-up are now high-ranking government officials, shocker, and that seems mighty nice to me that they all got these big, beautiful promotions after faking events. But speaking of one, there is a well-known faker-daker of our timeline, and his name is Robert Mueller. He was directly involved in the operations around Oklahoma City bombing. And yes, it is that same Robert Mueller. One of the things that makes a good story is consistency. You can tell it, it doesn't get boring, but you're not changing the story and removing pieces and adding new ones, right? It's like a good fairy tale. It always has the same fundamental story, which is one reason why I detest the bombing narrative, because it literally never stops changing. The bomb has grown in size by like 5 times what it was originally reported as by the government, because they realized a 1,000-pound Anfo bomb doesn't really make any sense for the damage, nor does 5,000, but that's a point for later. What's among the most maddening things for me about the story is about how many midwits are involved. It's got to be one of the best examples of a bell curve situation ever. And although it's a meme, it actually works really well in this situation, because you can see examples of this exact situation all over this case where midwits just keep getting in the way and keep covering it up and make it almost impossible for good, high quality work to actually occur. But on occasion, very seldom in this situation, it actually did, and it worked. And one of the best examples of this great work was done by a man named Brigadier General Benton K. Parting, U.S. Air Force retired. Benton was the former director of the Air Force Armament Technology Laboratory and one of the world's, yes, the world's most prominent experts in the realm of explosives and ordnances. So in other words, he lands right up here among those ultra intelligent, especially in this field. And he was also the leader of a group of people made up of all ends of the spectrum who were like, this makes no sense, we need to figure this out. And so he conducted a test where he went through all of the information, all of these pictures that even ones we don't have, and all this data. He was like, yeah, this makes no sense. He did the math. He was like, this couldn't have happened. This could not have been an ANFO bomb. So with that man's opinion, we should be grabbing the pitchforks and we should be solving this problem right now. But it doesn't stop there. Eglin Air Force Base was used to conduct a very certain study. The full name of the case is Case Study Relating Blast Effects of the Events of April the 19th of 1995, Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The more catchy title, though, is the Eglin Blast Effects Study, or EBES. It is 56 pages long, has photos and all the data from the blast included, including the data we don't have. They used a 3-story steel reinforced concrete structure on the base, 80 feet long, 40 feet wide, and a total height of 30 feet, which is nowhere near as large as the OKC building and therefore should more readily show signs of damage. The building is meant to represent the materials used and general similarities in shape of the building, but it is dramatically inferior in materials and quality overall. The study even goes so far as to say that this must be considered an inferior structure in terms of strength and blast resistance. It gets crazier though. The Murrah building was reinforced with 5 times more steel in its structure than the building used for the testing by the Air Force. So logically, if the Murrah building collapsed and got ripped apart by this bomb, then the Air Force Base building should be shattered. I mean, this thing should be in pieces across the map. The study continues for many pages after this and goes into length about just how clearly the difference can be seen here and what should in theory happen. It's like the difference if you're a cuckold between you and your wife's boyfriend. The Air Force conducted 3 tests on the weaker structure. The first was an air blast test, which used 704 pounds of tribunal, which is equivalent to 830 pounds of TNT, or 2,200 pounds of properly prepared ANFO bomb, which in the Air Force's report is stated as being most closely equivalent to that of the truck bomb. The bomb was then placed at a height and distance equivalent to that of the truck outside the Murrah building, and then they even encased it in an aluminum barrier to simulate the environment that the Ryder truck would have offered for the bomb. Here are the results. Look at the picture for yourself. It is needless to say that the damage comparison in between this vastly inferior building and what happened to the Murrah building is insane and makes it completely clear that that ANFO bomb was not what damaged the Murrah building, and that a more well-organized team must have planted actual military explosives within the Murrah building. Worth noting, the Air Force also then tested penetrating and non-penetrating explosive ordnances. And here's one from this first warhead, and you can see the damage is immense. And here's one from the second warhead. This is the penetrating one. The report has a ton of great information. They got the math, the diagrams, the photos, all the theories, reports, everything. But I think the conclusion says it really, really well, and I'll just read that chunk of it for you here. I do recommend reading the whole thing though. It says the following: it must be concluded that the damage at the Murrah Federal Building is not the result of the truck bomb itself, but rather due to other factors such as locally placed charges within the building itself. As can be seen from the tests conducted at Eglin Air Force Base under known conditions, producing damage to reinforced concrete structures is difficult. Reinforced concrete exhibits damage resistance that is far above other types of construction, including precast concrete and masonry. One of the most distinct individuals in this entire bombing situation is a bloke named Andre Strassmeyer. We did a deep dive on him in part 2, if you're interested, but I'll recap it here as well. Andre was a German-born son of the Chief of Staff for Helmut Kohl, who was the former Chancellor of Germany. Andre was a government asset for Germany, serving in their military at face value, but is heavily theorized to have been a member of GSG-9, which is the German Spec Ops counterterrorism unit. It's very highly trained for European standards. In addition to that, Andre was a known asset for the American government. Prior to the Oklahoma City bombing, when he arrived in the States for what was essentially the first time, he went to the Justice Department and tried to get an undercover position with them. And at face value, he was rejected. However, let's review the record very quickly, and you're going to notice a phenomenon. Andre, after seeking a position infiltrating groups with the Department of Justice, but was rejected, goes on to join a bunch of paramilitary groups and try and get them to commit crimes. Among them, purchasing explosives. And then you got your weapons and all sorts of other things. So, for sure a spook. But we actually get confirmation he's an asset when he made an oopsie-doopsie with a different militia, which is known as the TLI, or Texas Light Infantry Brigade, and for a while Andre was courting them. However, understandably, people in this organization were rather suspicious of this random German guy who just showed up and was trying to make friends with them and join their group. So a few of the members of the TLI, one night, decided to hop in their car and follow Andre home after he left. And clearly Andre had no idea he was being followed that night, because instead of taking that turn home, he took a different turn and wound up outside a federal government building. Now, the story could end there, and we have all the proof we need in my mind, but it continues. Andre proceeds to then get out of his vehicle, walk up to a back door, and type in the code to the locked federal office to get inside at night. Now, he might as well have a sign on his face then at this point that says, "I'm a Fed," but it continues. Andre was scheduled a host of times to be arrested for various crimes, including bombing-related ones, but he managed to just get away with it every time. There would be staged raids on his house, and they would just disappear. In one situation, he was pulled over by a highway patrolman for unknown reasons and was arrested for unknown reasons, and yet somehow the charges were dropped and within just a few hours got right back out. To this day, couldn't tell you what it was for, can't find any records on it. As for his muddy paws in the Oklahoma City bombing, his prints are everywhere. An array of eyewitnesses like Carol Howe and Jeff Matthews, who we'll speak about later, report and reference both Andre and Timothy McVeigh as knowing one another and being collaborators. And Andre is rumored to be a member of the ARA, the same organization that Timothy McVeigh was a part of. And we also know that Andre Strassmeyer received several calls from Timothy McVeigh in the lead up to the bombing, although Andre says it was only one and he missed the call because he wasn't at home. Although first he denied ever even receiving a call, so don't really trust his word. What's interesting though is that Andre was living out of Elohim City, and like Dennis Mahone and Carol Howe from earlier, which is why Carol Howe is such a reliable witness, especially about Andre. So when Andre arrives, we know that he deems himself the chief of security. No one asked for it, but he does it anyway. And he starts trying to get these people to also purchase illegal things from the government, including explosives, weapons, and armaments of various kinds. And possibly one of the most interesting things about Strassmeyer, though, is that it's well known and proven that McVeigh was calling Elohim City looking for him. Like, we know that's a fact, even though he denied it for a long time. But let's go one step further than this. There's an FBI teletype that details two men departing Elohim City and going to a place that is very nearby, Geary Lake State Park, where Timothy McVeigh is allegedly located, allegedly building a bomb. Lots of allegedlys here. Now, based on everything else we know and we'll continue to find out, we can assume that one of these men was Andre Strassmeyer because he receives a call and then leaves. Kind of convenient. But the other guy, I think, is a little bit harder to pin down. But to my best summation, he's a man named Michael Brescia, who we'll get into more later. Both of them are either ARA members or are believed to be ARA members and live at Elohim City, where Timothy McVeigh has been to and has sought help at and is part of this ARA group as well. So a lot of connections all around. And it does not take much brain power to see what's going on here. You have Andre, who's a member of military organizations, trying to go undercover here. If anyone knows how to build a bomb in this group, it would be him. And then he happens to go to almost exactly where the bomb is being built. Crazy. Oh, my back, bro. But we do have some other confirmation of how deeply involved Andre is in all of this. And it comes from a testimony revealed later on in the 2000s of a guy who worked for the CIA. The man was named David Holloway. He was a CIA pilot. And he has some very interesting things to say in his affidavit. He more recently espoused a knowledge of Andy Strassmeyer, who claimed to Holloway to have a military fatigue jacket of McVeigh's, and it was he who flew Strassmeyer back to Berlin, Germany, after the Oklahoma City bombing. That's right, this pilot is admitting to Andre Strassmeyer knowing more than he lets on about this whole thing and bragging about his possible involvement in the bombing, and yet we never get an investigation from the FBI into Andre Strassmeyer. But that doesn't really surprise me because if they were to investigate, they would just be incriminating themselves, so of course they didn't. However, there was one journalist with testicular fortitude on another level who caught on to this Andre Strassmeyer story and then was like, you know what, I'm gonna get an interview with that guy. And he actually managed to over the phone. And in that interview, there is an excellent portion from this man named Ambrose Evans Pritchard who did the interview, and he writes some insane stuff. But the most insane portion of all of it has to be this next segment, which I got from Margaret Roberts' book, Blowback. This is on page 336, 337, and 338, and 339, but let's continue. I recommend buying the book, it is so worth it. In the spring of 1996, British journalist Ambrose Evans Pritchard was on the trail of those questions a few months after Andre Strassmeyer slipped out of the US and flew home to Germany. In a series of interviews with Evans Pritchard, Strassmeyer spoke vicariously and seemingly with a deep knowledge about the bombing based on a, quote, very reliable source, those are Strassmeyer's words, who Evans Pritchard took to be Strassmeyer himself. I sensed that he was in deep anguish about the tragedy and wished to get some of it off of his chest, without violating any secret protocol he may have signed. Evans Pritchard wrote in his 1997 book, The Secret Life of Bill Clinton. Haha, Billy Boy's in this one, don't you worry. These are quotes. The different agencies weren't cooperating, Strassmeyer told Evans Pritchard. In fact, they were working against one another. You even had a situation where one branch of the FBI was investigating and not sharing anything with another branch of the FBI. But the ATF was the agency that most incited Strassmeyer's scorn. The ATF had an informant inside this operation, Strassmeyer said. They had advance warning, and they bungled it. What they should have done is make an arrest while the bomb was still being made instead of waiting till the last moment for a publicity stunt. Either you're a mass or you're an undercover agent, Evans Pritchard told Strassmeyer to push the subject to a disclosure. So who was it then? Evans Pritchard challenged the ATF, the Bureau, who are you working for? Strassmeyer prepared to bail. Look, I can't talk any longer. Evans Pritchard pressed on. There comes a time in every botched operation when the informant has to speak out to save his own skin. And that's now, Andre. The reporter had finally hit home. How can he? Strassmeyer shouted into the phone. What happens if it comes out that the plant was a provocateur? A provocateur? Evans Pritchard asked. What if he talked and manipulated the others into it? What then? The country couldn't handle it. The relatives of the victims are going to go crazy. He's going to be held responsible for the of 168 people. Strassmeyer had tiptoed to the edge but went no further. Reflecting on those interviews, Evans Pritchard conjectured that Strassmeyer was a shared asset on loan to the US government, but ultimately answering to German intelligence. When British journalist John Ronson interviewed Strassmeyer 5 years later, his position had hardened. Asked if he was ever an agent for any US agency, Strassmeyer replied, no, never. And there you have it, Strassmeyer admitting vicariously that not only was he involved in this huge event, the government was, it was staged, it was botched, and none of this was meant to happen. And that he feels that he himself is responsible for everything that happened that day because he had helped provoke it, which is essentially what Strassmeyer had done across the country with various organizations, was try and provoke them. And since then, there's been almost no word from Strassmeyer for like 20 years or something like that, except he's occasionally come out to deny claims that he was involved. Although this could be anybody, because I don't think anyone's seen Strassmeyer in 20 plus years, or I don't even know if there's a picture of him. I found a guy with the same name as a professor in Europe. Could be him, might not be, I don't know. The next few items on this berg are fast facts to rack you to your core. It's undeniable, despite government attempts to deny the fact, that there was indeed a bomb squad truck already parked outside the Mueller building, parked across the street in the hours prior to the bombing. No legitimate reason has ever emerged, but the government has attempted to say that simple maintenance was being done using the truck. But that makes basically no sense. Within minutes of the bombing, ATF agents were outside and ready to go in bomb squad gear, which is impossible for several reasons. The first is that bomb squad gear takes a fat minute to put on. I've seen estimates as high as a half an hour. Second of all, and possibly most important of all, is realistically, most or all of those ATF agents should have been dead because of the bombing. Because the ATF office was in the Mueller federal building and was in the death zone, but clearly because the ATF agents were already outside within a few minutes of the bombing, they weren't in there. And now Cooper, how could the ATF, not just some of their employees, but all of their workers, have been out of the building that day? Seems like a great coincidence, right? Well, I don't believe in coincidences, and neither should you, especially in this case. But we don't even have to speculate on this one, as several eyewitnesses tell us exactly why the ATF wasn't in that day. And it would be because one individual was told by an ATF agent that the ATF had been told not to come in, that they were in fact paged not to come in, and to stay away from the building. What a funny thing to say. Why said agents weren't present in the building is another rabbit hole that connects to several others we shall touch on later in parts 4, 5, and 6. But for now, the final part of Tier 3 is as follows. There are 2 books published by a man named David Paul Hammer, kind of a baller name. Big Dave was a wild man. At 19, he took 3 people hostage while high on PCP, which is obviously a bad look, and also he shot at somebody. Didn't hit, I'm fairly certain, but I know he didn't kill him. Somehow he got 400 years for this, which is insane. Let's just think of all people, the hundreds of thousands who've gotten off scot-free from crimes that they've committed in just these past few years, but let's continue for now. I don't want to digress too much. In September of 1996, Paul was accused of ending his cellmate's life. He fought this for a bit, didn't, and then pled guilty. We don't really know exactly what happened there and if he did it or not, but it's hard to tell. It's a whole kerfuffle. That's what you need to know. But most importantly, Hammer was supposed to be executed by lethal injection in the year 2000. But then that got postponed because he didn't want to die, and then he did want to die, and then he didn't. It goes back and forth. Once again, kerfuffle. It's a bizarre story, genuinely worth the read. Eventually, though, Hammer seems to have come to the faith and raised money for abused children via Catholic charity. And we're talking a lot of money. It was $92,000 in 90s, early 2000s money, which is double that today. But what Hammer should be most well known for is his friendship with Timothy McVeigh. They are both on death row together. Hammer having spent roughly 40 years in prison, minus 2 times he escaped for a short while. In addition to that, of those 40 years, he spent 30 of them in solitary confinement. And of those 40 years, he also spent 16 of them on death row. So needless to say, doesn't really make friends very easily. And basically since the age of 19, this man was in prison. So weird position, doesn't often have the chance to make friends, let alone maybe even a desire to. But McVeigh was interesting to him. He wanted to know more. Why did you do it, man? What were the facts? What else was going on? At first, McVeigh was not very forthcoming, but that would change. McVeigh, while in prison, was sort of an idiot, as we've come to see him as, and he started calling a Latin gang a bunch of Latin slurs, which didn't work out too well for him, and he got his prison wallet attacked. Not something the media ever reports, because in large part, you can see, if this mastermind criminal was a mastermind criminal, why would he go and then get himself violently assaulted in the butthole? Which is something I personally believe Hammer also noticed, because after that, McVeigh started opening up to him a little more. And so Hammer promised McVeigh that he would keep him safe if McVeigh would tell him everything about the Oklahoma City bombing, and what went on, the government's role, and all the secret stuff behind the scenes that no one else knows. And considering these two men have nothing to lie about, no reason to, nothing to gain, it is going to be one of the eeriest stories you were ever told. And considering that these men only had about an hour a day outside of their cells, compiling as much data and conversation as they could, putting the story together. And the things that this Hammer guy got, I mean, they are for the books. Some of the craziest things I've ever read about any case I've ever done. But those writings in Hammer's books are going to have to be discussed another time because we are almost out of hours. But it is interesting to note that Hammer believes and reported that the federal government recorded every single one of these conversations with McVeigh, which then means that the federal government has all the footage of these interviews and could also prove the situation, what really happened. And that way, if we got our hands on that footage, which I'm gonna come out and ask, if you have access to that footage, send it to me. If you have access to other important materials on this matter, send it to me, because the truth needs to be out there. That all being said, I humbly believe that if the whole country watched this video or read these books, that we would very quickly be engulfed in probably a second civil war, because we would see the sheer level of corruption. I mean, we are talking Epstein levels of problems here. I mean, we are mad about the Epstein files, and we should have them already, but I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that Oklahoma City bombing reveals more of the corruption than the Epstein files do. I know that sounds crazy, but just you wait. With this all being said, until next time, thank you guys so much for watching. The truth is always out there. We just gotta look. I'll see you in the next one.